Hey, good morning, everybody. It's Monday, start of another week, the 13th of April. Is there any such thing as Monday the 13th being bad luck? I don't know. I hope not. Let's not tempt fate. It's me, Captain Awesome. It's tea time. Got a little cup of tea here. No cookies today. Trying to keep my figure down to a manageable amount. As always, I'm glad you're here. I'm glad that you've joined me. And today we are going to talk about hermit crabs. Amazing little creatures, some not so small, and something that we encounter quite a bit on Cape Cod. I've seen a lot of people at the beaches, both on the north and the south side, who will collect them in a bucket, maybe with the hopes of taking them home back to Connecticut or New Jersey. Let me definitively tell you that that is a bad idea. You will probably not be able to keep those hermit crabs alive. You probably will not be able to collect enough shells for them to move into the bigger shell as time goes on. And they will probably die en route to your home, wherever that may be. So one of the things I always recommend to everyone that is here on the Cape and visiting for the summer is that you should not keep living things. You should not collect animals. You should not try to keep them alive. You should observe them in their natural environment. We oftentimes carry little containers like this, little glass containers or big white tubs. We put water in it. We observe the animal. We take pictures of it. And then we let that animal go. We try to value all the life that we find, including the plankton. A couple of things. I did get the microscope working properly on the TV. So on Wednesday, we will absolutely be doing another plankton program. I will go down and scoop some plankton. I've modified the microscope a bit so that it will hopefully work even better than it did last time. And I'm super excited. I know that when I was at the canal the other day, I found a number of gooseberry comb jellies as well as some lion's mane jellies. And those are usually in when the plankton is starting to grow. We're right at that point where that warm water and that oxygenated water are going to generate a lot of plankton, lots of larval animals out there. So that should be really cool on Wednesday. Also, if you're interested, my Instagram is Cape Cod Explorer, if you want to check that out. And I've actually got a TikTok now. That's right. I might be a little old, but I'm trying to keep up. TikTok, and that is The Real Captain Awesome. Keeping it simple over there, putting a 15-second fact of the day every day. I'm going to go out and weather this rain and see if I can find something cool today. So on to our subject of the day, which is hermit crabs. Hold on. Let's see. There we go. Hermit crabs. Coolest crabs around. I think, anyway. They're pretty nifty little critters. There's a couple of major groups. We're going to talk about the major groups of hermit crabs. We're going to talk about their biology a little bit. And then we're going to talk about the local species. As I mentioned, people scoop them up a lot here and try to gather them. There's two major local species that we'll talk about. And then there's some deep water species that the lobster and the fishermen guys get. We don't see those very often, but they're very, very cool. So first, hold on. Major groups. There's two major types of hermit crabs. There's terrestrial hermit crabs and marine hermit crabs. The terrestrial hermit crabs you're probably familiar with because you've seen them in pet stores all over the place. So I grew up on Cape Cod. I've lived on Cape Cod my whole life. I've been to Myrtle Beach. I've been to Venice Beach. Been to Miami Beach. I've been to all those kind of beaches all over the country. And almost universally, they all have the same shop that sells the same little keychains and the same t-shirts. One of them just says Cape Cod, the other one says Boynton Beach, the other one says Venice Beach, but they all have the same thing. And almost universally, all of those places have land-based hermit crabs. Most of those land-based hermit crabs come from the Caribbean part of the world. They're red, they're decorative. Sometimes they have kind of fancy decorative shells or painted shells that they sell you to move them. Those are interesting pets. You can keep them alive for a while. They will not reproduce in captivity, but those are the terrestrial types of hermit crabs, right? So they do reproduce in the marine environment. They do need to have salt water to reproduce in. So I was in Barbados at one point in time, and I had gone down to go snorkeling. And there was this like march of the land-based hermit crabs coming down the hill towards the water. And I realize now that what they were doing was coming down to the water to reproduce. They are a crab. They are, and actually not a true crab. They're a crab that is more related to kind of the squat lobsters. But they do need salt water in order to reproduce. They also need salt water in order to breathe, and we'll talk about that in a second, even though they're a land-based crab, right? So they reproduce in the marine environment. Here's kind of a typical terrestrial hermit crab. There's a number of different species. This is the one that you may encounter in the store or when you're out on land, right? They need to be near the salt water, both to reproduce and because they kind of have to dip themselves in the salt water and collect a little bit of moisture in order to keep their gills, which are inside the shell, wet. They have to keep the gills damp and wet in order to extract oxygen from the air. If the gills dry out, the hermit crab is going to die. So that's why it's important that in your tank, that if you have a pet hermit crab, you have to have some water in that tank. Why? So they have to take a dip. Sorry, this is kind of goofing me up a little bit here. They have to be able to take a dip in order to get that oxygen and to be able to reproduce. Here's another one of those typical land-based hermit crabs. This is typical of the Caribbean island kind of crabs. They are not what we call a sustainable pet. They're actually considered unsustainable. In order to supply the pet trade, they have to be caught in the wild. They will not breed in captivity. People have tried. It's very, very difficult. I would say impossible because they haven't been able to do it. So every single hermit crab that you see in those shops at the different beaches is a wild caught animal and will generally perish within a few months with you. So you have to be very careful and make smart choices about these kind of animals and pets that you're bringing home. Now we're talking about the marine species of hermit crab. There's one freshwater species of hermit crab. We're not even going to talk about that. There are a total of a little better than 1,100 species of hermit crabs around the world. And they are what we call ubiquitous. They occur in almost all of the waters, cold and warm, around the world. Many of you may be familiar with hermit crabs, even if you don't live near the beach, because they are a common inhabitant of marine reef tanks, of the tanks that people keep reef fish in or corals and things like that, and they are an excellent cleaner in the tank. They have little claws. They go around and grab little stuff, and one of the things they do is sometimes they camouflage themselves. They will actually pick anemones and coral and algae and cement it onto the shell that they're living in. They're so particular about that, in fact, that sometimes they will, when they move into a new shell, they'll pick the stuff off of the old shell and put it onto the new one. They can survive outside of the water for short periods. Again, they have to be mostly damp, but for the most part, they need to be in the water. When you see one, there's generally more about. They actually bury themselves in the sand and will just kind of have their eye stalks sticking up above the sand. There's deep water species that live in the darker water that tend to be a little bit more active. This is an example of one of those deep water species. You see these big anemones that he has attached to itself, and he's very hairy and bristly. And the reason he's hairy and bristly is because that's what they're smelling with. And so that's his way of finding food. He's smelling with all of those hairs all over his body. They are not a good pet. The wild caught ones that you go to the beach. The ones that you get for the reef tank environment, they're not going to last tremendously long, but they are going to be a good cleaner. And if the environment is correct, they're going to have plenty of food. Though, again, it's very difficult to get them to reproduce. So those are the two main types of hermit crabs, terrestrial and marine. Now we're going to talk about a little more dialed in about the biology and taxonomy of a hermit crab. So hermit crab here, we are talking about a local hermit crab, the flat-clawed hermit crab. Obviously, they're in the animal kingdom. Their phylum, they're an arthropod. They're a crustacean. And then their classes become a little different. And then they're a decapod. That means that they have 10 claws. And then their superfamily, which we don't usually deal with, is the Puragoidea. And then the family Purigaidae and the genus Pagaris. P. pollicaris is the one that we're talking about here, the flat-clawed hermit crab. And we'll deal with that a little bit better. But that's the general taxonomy of the horseshoe crab. They're almost all in that superfamily Pagaroidea. Again, more closely related to squat lobsters than they are to true crabs. This is kind of an image of what a good drawn image of a one in a moon snail shell. I have a couple of videos lined up that we'll talk about in a minute as well, but this is one of those videos. All right, you can kind of see the tail kind of curled around inside the shell. And here's the anatomy of a hermit crab. So they have these small claws. They tend not to have really big claws. These are not what we would call a voracious predator. Most of them are scavengers. They eat whatever they can find. So they have these claws that are made for kind of tearing and picking, and then they put them into their mouth, and the chelicerae kind of grind them up and move them down into the gullet. Only the first 3 sets of claws are readily visible to us. The 4th and 5th set of claws are much smaller and are inside the shell when they're wrapped up inside the shell. And then they have a lot of little kind of furry swimmerets called pleopods, which hold eggs on a female, or move water around, or sweep feces outside of the shell. Also, they have these things called uropods, which are used to grip the shell. I can tell you that once they have a tight grip, it is really hard to pull a hermit crab out of a shell. We don't like to do it because we can actually cause damage to the hermit crab. Every once in a while, we'll find one that is deceased, that is not in the shell, and that's always an interesting look-see. From that kind of 4th and 5th claw down, everything is very soft. And that is one of the reasons why it inhabits a shell, because it's a soft crab from that point in time, easily eaten by lots of other things. And as you'll see in a minute, it only takes, boom, to switch from one shell to another. I wish I was better at this stuff, folks. You'll have to forgive me. Right? So here's this cool glass shell that an artist made so that you can see the hermit crab inside the glass shell. It's shaped the same way that a regular shell is, but we're seeing the horseshoe the hermit crab coiled up inside of it with its claws in the front. They can use those claws to also, some of them, to kind of over the entrance to protect themselves as well. There's another look-see. This is the kind of soft, squishy part. You can see those two little claws that are inside, and then the uropods that holds it in place. In another angle, you can see that right in the shell. They can kind of inflate it as well to make themselves stick really well inside that shell. So that's the basic biology. Interesting thing about their reproduction, most invertebrates, even if they hold on to the shells, when the eggs hatch, they're in a very larval stage, and they go through a number of stages before they become adults. The hermit crab egg goes through those first 2 stages of larva in the actual egg. When they hatch, they've only got 1 molt until they drop to the bottom. Now we're going to talk about the 2 major species local here to Cape Cod, right? The first is the flat-clawed hermit crab, Pagaris pollicaris. It is pretty large, decent size. It generally lives in moon snail and whelk shells. It's pretty large. We don't encounter it very often. If we were at Paynes Creek and we went all the way out at low tide to where the eelgrass is growing, that's generally where we're going to find those flat-clawed hermit crabs, or we may get them in a trap because they've come in a little bit shallower at night. This is a completely harmless animal. It can pinch a little bit, but it won't hurt, not much strength. It mostly eats algae. That's what it eats for the most part, though it will scavenge some other stuff, but mostly it eats algae. Its biggest predator is a fish. All kinds of fish eat these guys. Herring, cunners, scup, love to eat them. If they get caught outside of their shell, they're going to get torn to pieces. And it often has this thing called a zebra flatworm living commensally inside of its shell. So what that means is there's a little space inside the shell. And in that space, another animal lives with the hermit crab, and that animal is generally a zebra flatworm. I'm not sure if the flatworm is eating stuff that the hermit crab excretes or if it's eating other animals that come into the shell. I just know that it lives there a lot. So I do not think people eat hermit crabs. Not entirely sure. But I also only recently found out that people eat pangolins. So anything is possible at this point, I think. And then our next, so here's a good image of one. This guy is in what we call a knobbed whelk. You can tell it's a knobbed whelk because it has these little knobs all around the side. And then the next one is in a moon snail. This is typically where we'll find these guys, in a moon snail shell, also known as a shark's eye. Really cool animal. You can see he's even got bits of algae that he was eating when he was picked up. Then our second type of local hermit crab is called the long-wristed hermit crab. You can see how, in proportion to its body, these claws are really long and spread out. Pagaris longicarpus, longe meaning long, carpus meaning wrist bone, right? The carpal tunnel syndrome is your wrist bone, carpus, so long wrist, okay? It is probably our most abundant local species. It's very small, and it's a scavenger. It eats anything, whatever it can find. Algae, dead animals. They'll eat each other, given the opportunity. They absolutely do not fool around when it comes to that stuff. They're a scavenger. They eat all kinds of different things. And then they're also an animal that can survive kind of great changes in the oxygen level of the water, the temperature of the water, and the salinity of the water. In our local salt marshes, there are areas, depressions in the salt marshes, where when the tide goes out, water is left behind. It's like a tide pool, but it's in the salt marsh, and it's called a salt pan. When the tide goes out, those pans are open to the air and to the sun, sometimes for 6 hours out, 6 hours in, say 10 hours. As a result, the oxygen level becomes very low, the salinity increases, and the temperature increases. These guys can survive that. So there's lots to eat in those salt pans, and when they're in the salt pan, there's less predators. So it's a good spot for them to be. So it's an excellent adaptation that they're able to survive and live in those salt pans. Here on the Cape, we're mostly going to find them in periwinkle shells or mudwhelk shells. They're very small. This is the animal that you will see when you maybe don't notice them at first, and then you're going to look down at the beach and you're going to go, oh, look, a hermit crab. Oh, look, another hermit crab. Oh, look, another hermit crab. And all of a sudden you'll notice that there's tons of them. I often talk about the battles that humans are used to seeing between animals on television. We're used to seeing lions chase down wildebeests or giant bears grappling with each other in Yellowstone National Park, because maybe a fight, of great size is what happens. But these long-wristed hermit crabs are all day, every day, fighting with each other. I mean, these guys have epic battles. If there's one that has a shell that another wants, they will fight. And it's possible that the one hermit crab will kill the other and eat it in order to take possession of the shell. Resources can be scarce, so they fight over territories to see who gets the best food. They fight over reproductive status. These are active, constantly in conflict, warring animals, but they're small. I would highly recommend that if you go to the beach, you just kind of sit and watch for a little while. Pick out a spot and watch the hermit crabs. You will see things like you think only happen on the African savanna. It's very, very, very amazing. I love to watch them. Sometimes I take them home in a little bucket, take some photographs, do a little video, and then take them back and release them. It's important that you release them where you found them. Anytime you take an animal out of the wild, you should always try to release it back where you found it. So that's pretty much the hermit crab presentation. I'm going to show you a couple of videos real quick. Here is that GIF that I was talking about before, where it shows you how the hermit crab is coiled around on the inside of the shell with those opopods that hold it in, and those long, big, broad claws in the front that keep it protected to a certain extent. And then I want to show you a couple of videos of the hermit crabs swapping their shells, because when they move from one shell to another, that is when they're at their most vulnerable. So here goes the first video. So watch how fast this happens. Look, boop, that's it. He just moved out and moved in. That took maybe a second or two to have that happen. I tell you, it is extremely difficult to pull a hermit crab out of its shell, and you will do damage to it if you do. But look, he just comes out. There goes the tail. He's all prepped and ready to go. And then he's going to put his thorax, tail part, into the other shell. Now, sometimes the shell may not be the right size, so he'll pop right out and go right back into the shell that he was just in and try it again. Okay? So here's another one. This is with the glass shells. This is an artist who does this. He makes the craftsy shells, and then you can see everything that's happening. This is a land hermit crab, but it's essentially the same.
Oh, he's going to change. Here he goes.
Process.
Here he goes. Look at, he's changing. It's a big one.
Yeah.
Yay!
You
can see him cord curled right up in, and off he goes. So I just want to show you guys real quick. This is us, Cape Cod Learning Tours. Currently not really doing any tours until this whole thing is kind of gone by. We're going to continue. Robin, yes, the female carries her eggs with her inside the shell. And then when they hatch, they're already what they call noptids. They only need to molt once to go to the bottom and try to find shells. They're very, very small, but they will find the tiniest shells. They don't have a success rate. Like every kind of invertebrate, she lays 10,000 eggs at a time. Maybe 2 or 3 will get to be to adulthood. Okay? A couple of things I just wanted to mention. We're going to keep doing these Facebook Lives every day at 2 o'clock. We're glad you could join us. Locally, we're going to be on the Community Media Center, Channel 99, soon. I'm very excited about that. And also, the one big thing that we're doing in the fall is a Penakees Island excursion. We're going to take 20 people out to Penakees Island. We're going to spend the weekend out there for an immersive nature and quiet experience. It's going to be pretty fantastic. It's a very unique, amazing place here on the Cape. Once again, thank you for joining me. I'm thrilled that you're here. I'm glad you've decided to spend this half hour with me. I hope that you're doing okay. And as always, I would urge you to be kind, enjoy nature, get out and explore a little bit within reason. Remember what we said, you can find lots of stuff right in your backyard. And we'll see you at 2 o'clock tomorrow. Always looking for suggestions of things that you'd like me to cover. So please feel free to direct message me or send some messages on the Facebook page. And we'll see you tomorrow. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.